There, is everybody seeing my presentation? Thank you, Mike, for the thumbs up. Very good. Well, thanks for all being here. I've got just a quick briefing for you today. I'm going to focus on the Western United States, and here are the key takeaways just from the start. What we've seen as summer has moved into fall and as we're now into mid-fall is that we still have areas of extreme drought conditions that are persisting across the West. We had an abnormally warm and dry summer across many portions of the West, and our early fall has not really changed things. Soils have remained dry in this region and led to drought disaster designations for, quite frankly, most counties across the West. I'll show a map of that in a bit. Drought conditions have actually reemerged in the northern Great Plains over the last month, as we'll see. The Climate Prediction Center out of NOAA is predicting that a weak La Nina will continue for fall and winter of 2025-26. And this generally leads to persistent dry conditions across the Southwest, the Southern Rockies, and the Southern Plains. The Climate Prediction Center is sort of following suit, and their drought outlooks are echoing that we expect persistence or emergence of drought conditions across the Southern Plains. And then in the more near term, you all have probably heard about this in the news just the last couple of days. There's a prediction for a phenomenon that is pretty rare called a sudden stratospheric warming event happening early next week. This is a polar event, but what it does is it weakens the Arctic jet stream and actually makes it so that we can get wobbles in that jet stream, and they're predicting below normal temperatures across much of the northern Great Plains, and this could have some big impacts, especially for our ranchers. So I'm going to get into all of that. Here's the latest U.S. Drought Monitor. This is from last week. As you all know, the Drought Monitor publishes their maps on Thursdays, effective the prior Tuesday. So we won't get a new map until Thursday, but this is, from what I'm seeing on the listserv this week, this is pretty close to where we expect to be next week. What we see here is a pretty spotty situation with extreme drought conditions still persisting across many portions of the Western United States. You see down along the New Mexico and Arizona border, that area of extreme drought has been remarkably persistent. And then we've seen this emergence of drought up here in the Idaho Panhandle, southeastern Washington, really over the last 3 or 4 months, and it doesn't seem to be going away. And we can see that, I'm just going to zoom forward in my little animation here. We can see that the way that has grown since last summer and going into last winter. We had a snow drought that just burst onto the scene in the Northern Rockies, and then that persisted through the summer, where we had really low flows pretty much everywhere from the headwaters of the Blackfoot River through the Idaho Panhandle. This is tributaries of the Snake and Columbia rivers, and just really dry conditions there. Luckily, and all of us know this if you live up here, we had a relatively mild fire season in this region, which is really remarkable considering how dry our forest systems were. Quite frankly, we were just lucky to get out of this relatively unscathed. Let's break this down. I'm just going to show the Western United States. You're going to see the standard drought metrics across the Pacific Northwest, California Great Basin, Missouri, Colorado, and Southern Plains. And then I've added Alaska and Hawaii in there just to give you a sense of what's happening for those of you who are out in Alaska and Hawaii. Here we are just since January of 2020. So we're just moving through the last 5 years. And what you can see in the far right hand side of this graph is our recent conditions. Areas like the Pacific Northwest and the Colorado River Basin have been effectively in almost 100% abnormally dry or drought conditions over the last year, effectively in the Colorado River Basin, especially. Doing a little better in the California Great Basin. Our Missouri River, most of this has been along the northern edge of the upper Missouri River Basin. And then what we're seeing right now is the emergence of some more dry conditions and droughty conditions across the southern plains. Hawaii has been remarkably dry this year, including mostly up on the Big Island, where we've seen almost 100% of the Hawaiian Islands in abnormally dry or drought conditions. We can see that, of course, going all the way back to the origins of the US Drought Monitor in 2000, that we often have. And I say this every time, but I think it bears remembering right now as we're going into a La Nina event. When we go into them, we always come out of them, as we'll see. And as we come out of La Nina events, we often see a cascading trajectory of drought conditions that move effectively from the southern plains up north through the Missouri River Basin and exit out of the Pacific Northwest. And I think we can start expecting that soon. I'll get into that. Just wanted to share this. We've started. Many of you know that the FSA programs that are triggered by drought effectively flood counties with the worst drought conditions that the county is experiencing, such that if you're here in Missoula County, if a little portion of the county is experiencing D3 or extreme drought conditions, then that triggers a certain amount of assistance for all producers in that county, based on the triggers for, say, the livestock disaster assistance program. I've done the same thing here, except for tribal reservations, just to highlight reservations that are really experiencing this D3 drought conditions across the nation right now. This was a quick and dirty map, but what we can see is that up in the northern Great Plains, Fort Belknap is currently under extreme drought conditions. Many of our other tribal communities are under severe drought conditions, including Blackfeet and the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. In the Idaho Panhandle and in eastern Washington, we also have extreme drought conditions. Our colleagues down in Utah, the Uinta Ute reservation, currently is in those extreme conditions, as well as portions of the Navajo Nation and several other reservations in Arizona. So we see that tribal communities across the West are being impacted by these severe, extreme drought conditions that we're seeing. Now, how did we get here? Well, this is just looking at the precipitation anomaly over the last 90 days. So this is just going from mid-August through just a couple of days ago. And what we see is that we've had abnormally dry conditions, less precipitation than normal across the northern plains, especially here in Montana. Portions of North and South Dakota have actually had more precipitation than normal. So it's really across what we consider the high line up here in northern Montana. Portions of Oregon, Washington, and there's that Idaho Panhandle. It really has stuck out as a place of persistent abnormally dry conditions. And then, as I mentioned, the southern plains have also, including most of Texas, have had really dry conditions. The Southern Rockies has been a mixed bag. So we had some areas where we got those nice monsoonal moisture towards the end of the summer, but other areas of the Rockies were slightly drier than normal. Recently, we've had several large atmospheric river events. You've heard about the flooding that's occurring in California. That's what you're seeing here are these large precipitation events, these storms that have hit the California coast. Simultaneously, we've had a really wildly warm weather, even going into November here across the entire West. Just much warmer than normal. That persistent warmth, coupled with that spotty aridity, those spotty dry areas, have led to our standardized precipitation and evapotranspiration index. This is just a measure of water balance and the amount that the atmosphere is sucking water out of our soils and our plants. What we see is that we have more evapotranspiration, more of that sucking of water out of the land up here in the northern plains and down in the southern plains as well. And then again, sort of a mixed bag as we look across the rest of the West. So there's our current USDM. You are all very aware that the U.S. Drought Monitor is one of the primary triggers for USDA secretarial disaster designations for drought. This is a map since the beginning of the year of where we've had those secretarial disaster designations for drought. This is one of the primary things that triggers relief programs, for both in terms of eligibility for emergency loans, and programs like the Livestock Forage Disaster Program. If you live in a county that's red or orange on here, red being counties that have experienced certain levels of drought, usually the trigger is 8 weeks of severe D2 level drought or more will trigger you to be a primary county for a disaster designation. Those are the red ones. And then contiguous counties, counties that border primary counties, are in orange here, and you're also eligible for many of the relief programs that are triggered by these disaster designations. What we can see is that most of the counties in the Western U.S. are currently eligible or have received these disaster designations and may be eligible for certain relief programs. All right. So, what are we doing going into the future? Well, one of the biggest drivers of our winter weather here in the Western United States is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, El Ninos and La Ninas. El Ninos tend to lead to warmer than normal temperatures in the Northern Rockies, Southern Rockies with wetter temperatures because you get this Pacific jet stream that sort of cuts across the Southwest and makes it wet. La Nina winters are the opposite, drier and warmer across the South, and wetter and cooler across the North. That's the typical pattern. So where are we at? Well, right now, here's the El Nino Southern Oscillation since 2000. We were in a strong El Nino event during the winter of 2023 going into 2024. Last winter, 24 going into 25, we had a very weak La Nina event. And then we've been in these neutral conditions ever since then. The Climate Prediction Center runs many different models saying, what are our conditions likely to be going into the future? Right now, we've been diving back into La Nina conditions. And these are all of those different, think of it as possible futures, but sort of likely futures. So we've got all of these different models that have been run, and then the dashed line here is the average of all of those models. And what we see is that the average of all of the models for the El Nino Southern Oscillation are that we'll go into another weak La Nina event and then emerge rather quickly from that out into ENSO neutral conditions. So the prediction for early winter into the new year is a weak La Nina, and then coming out back into neutral conditions, which are neither El Nino or La Nina, and then potentially moving into an El Nino event as we move further on into 2026. Here's that in a graphical form. Each of these are 3 months. So October, November, December, November, December, January, and so on. And this is the probability of being either in a La Nina that's blue. And I like that they use this color scheme because I'm in the Northern Rockies. Blue is cold, right? So up here in the Northern Rockies, La Ninas are cold, but it's sort of the opposite down in the Southern Rockies. So we've got a high likelihood of being in a La Nina event during October, November, December. We're already entering into one, so that's easy to say. A little bit weaker in November, December, January. We start getting to about even odds of La Nina or neutral conditions once we're in December, January, February, so going through into the new year, and then we start seeing a higher likelihood of moving into that neutral space as we move into the new year. So exactly what those all those models were just showing us. So again, what we're expecting is a weak La Nina, which tends to mean wetter and cooler in the northern part of the West, and drier and possibly warmer in the southern part of the West. So the Climate Prediction Center actually produces outlooks based in part on these conditions. So let's look at what those outlooks have. So here we go. Right now, oh, sorry, I just wanted to say one other thing is that we often have this relationship. You'll notice here, I've taken that same El Nino, La Nina. So La Ninas are the blue down here where we're below the center line. El Ninos are the red areas up top in this bottom bar. And what we're seeing is the juxtaposition of our U.S. drought monitor in these El Nino and La Nina events. And what we see is that often when we're coming out of a La Nina event, or when we're in them and then coming out of them, is when we start seeing the sort of recycling of this regional pattern that we have of drought emerging in the southern plains and then moving up through the Colorado, California Great Basin, Missouri, and Pacific Northwest basins. And so, if we actually do strongly emerge out of this weak La Nina and up towards El Nino conditions, I expect droughty conditions to really emerge in the southern plains and then trickle up through these basins if that pattern holds. All right, those here are the outlooks that I promised you. 6 to 10 day. These were published yesterday. So this is just for through the end of next week, through the end of this week. Excuse me. So we've got near normal conditions across much of the West, maybe slightly below normal temperature in the far southwest and far northwest. Below normal precipitation, we're going to see a shift away from this atmospheric river pattern that we've been seeing down in California, and possibly above normal precipitation across the southern plains where it's desperately needed, and up here in the northern Rockies. 8 to 14 day temperature outlook. This is where we're getting into this stratospheric warming event. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we're expecting for Thanksgiving week much below normal temperatures across the northern Rockies, and in fact, somewhat below normal temperatures across most of the West, near normal across the central part of the country, and then above normal precipitation outlook for the northern plains during that same period. So it could be a wet and cold, and for those of us up here in the mountainous regions, a wet, cold, and snowy Thanksgiving, which is sort of exciting. We haven't had one of those in quite some time. Weeks 3 to 4, this is going through sort of December, that pattern continues below normal conditions in terms of temperature across the northern plains, and then above normal potential for precipitation across that same region, maybe a little bit to the west over here in Montana and in western and northern Idaho. So wet and cool. As we move out into our seasonal predictions, this is where those El Nino, La Nina conditions, the La Nina that we're expecting, even though it's weak, really sort of take over. They swamp these climate prediction center predictions, especially in the winter months. And that's what we're seeing here. Weak La Nina, we're seeing equal chances of either above or below normal temperatures across the northern tier of the country, but above normal precipitation, where we get those storm systems coming in off the Pacific, those Alaska lows, that could lead to more above normal precipitation across the northern tier. Across the southern tier of the West, especially the Southern Rockies, the opposite pattern. Above normal temperatures across especially the Four Corners region down into Texas, and below normal precipitation across the entire southern tier. This gets pretty speculative. This is the 6-month outlook. So here we're looking February, March, April. So the end of winter, moving into spring. But it's much the same pattern as we're predicting to start moving out of that La Nina condition. Cooler in the north, warmer in the south. Wetter in the north, drier in the south. So the Climate Prediction Center takes those climate outlooks and applies them to the drought map. This is the U.S. drought outlook through the end of the month. This is where we expect there to be persistence of drought in the brown areas, development of droughty conditions in the yellow areas, so where we don't currently have drought, but they're expecting, because of that, those drier than normal conditions or warmer than normal conditions, to have the emergence of drought. And then areas where we expect improvement and removal of drought. We expect it to be wetter than normal as we move into this La Nina cycle here in the Pacific Northwest. And that's why we're expecting there to be a removal of drought in that region. As we look out in their seasonal forecast, this is going through the end of January, the pattern remains much the same. Removal or amelioration of droughty conditions across the Pacific Northwest, where we're expecting these storm systems to be rolling in. Perhaps the persistence of droughty conditions in the rain shadow and across that northern portion of the plains here in Montana, where we've actually seen the emergence of drought. And then the expansion of drought conditions across Texas and the southern plains. And that's going to be a big part of the story as we're in this La Nina and then moving out. Remember, I talked about how as we are in La Ninas and then moving out of La Ninas, we often see droughty conditions emerging in the southern plains. And then we see a pattern of cascading through many of our hydrologic basins across the West. But it starts here in the southern plains, and that's what's expected as we move into the winter. So the last thing I want to talk about is what you've been hearing about in the news, which is this sudden stratospheric warming event that is now being predicted for the Arctic over the next couple of weeks. What this does is it weakens what's called our polar vortex, or the strong polar jet stream. The jet stream is this circle of air that's going around the pole. And when we've got a strong jet stream, it actually keeps this polar vortex, which is just a bunch of cold air that's moving quickly in the upper atmosphere. It keeps it all up in the Arctic. It's cold where it should be. But when we have a sudden stratospheric warming event, which has only happened a few times over the last few decades, it's sort of a pretty unusual event, that can weaken the polar jet stream and actually make it so that it's not containing that cold air. The cold air moves south, the jet stream gets wobbly and weak, and we can have areas where we get much colder intrusions, these Arctic intrusions that we have experienced that are not always from these sudden stratospheric warming events. And then when we've got this wobbly jet stream, you can also have abnormally warm areas. So it just makes things weird. And it's seeming like we're going to go into a period of some weirdness starting at the beginning of next week. So what does that mean? Well, this is taking the same sort of models as I was showing you, except this is a gridded approach. And this is looking at just the next 8 to 14 days. So this is Thanksgiving week. And this is looking at the maximum temperatures over Thanksgiving week. So think about how warm it is getting today where you are, especially if you're here in Montana or North or South Dakota up in the northern plains. Well, we're expecting high temperatures across where my friend Vicky is, across North Dakota in the 10 to 30 degree range. Those are the high temperatures. Our low temperatures for next week are going to average down in the 10 to 20 degree range for much of the high plains in the northern Great Plains and then portions of the Rocky Mountains. This is pretty below normal, especially up here in the northern plains for this time of year. And so if you've got cattle, if you've got interests outdoors, now's the time to start making those preparations for pretty cold weather in that 10 to 20 degree range for your lows at night for Thanksgiving week. At that same time, this isn't that exciting of a map, but this is actually inches of liquid precipitation. What we're expecting is the potential for an atmospheric river event coming through across, not down in California, but up here hitting the northern northwest coast in Washington, portions of Oregon, the Cascade Range, and then coming over here into the Northern Rockies, where portions of the Northern Rockies here we're expecting over 4 inches of liquid precipitation. That'll be much more in terms of our snow precipitation. So we're going to see some nice additions to our snowpack across our high ranges in the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies over the next 8 to 14 days, which I'm excited about. So just to reiterate our key takeaways, and thanks for bearing with me. We still have extreme drought conditions that are spotty but persistent across the West, and we've experienced drought conditions reemerging in the northern Great Plains. The big story of this winter is that we are going into a weak La Nina, which can lead to persistent dry conditions across the Southwest, Southern Rockies, and Southern Plains. The Climate Prediction Center is expecting drought development across the Southern Plains, including most of Texas. And then in the near term, we're experiencing a really neat thing called a sudden stratospheric warming event that will lead to below normal temperatures across much of the northern Great Plains. And so it's good to take precautions and get ready. And I'll take any questions that we have. Thanks, Kelsey. You all, if anybody's feeling like they don't want to ask questions out loud, you're very welcome to pop them in the chat as well. You don't have a Q&A open right now.
No questions, but I always appreciate your updates.
Oh, well, thank you. All right. Well, if I did such a good job that nobody has any questions, thank you all so much for being here. We will see you again in January. Be on the lookout for an email from Vicky about our January meeting. In the meantime, take care. Have a happy holiday, everyone, and I hope to talk to you all soon.
Thanks, Kyle.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.